Hi there. Welcome back. Every story you hear is not just about the past, but also a way to feel, to understand, and to grow your English naturally. So stay with us till the end. Listen, feel, and let the stories of time guide your English journey. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell to travel through history with us every week. The Road to War, 1918, 1939. Chapter 1, The Shadow of Defeat, 1918, 1920. On the 1st of September, 1939, the world awoke to the sound of war once more. German troops stormed across the Polish border in a ruthless assault, determined to win a swift and absolute victory. Yet scarcely 20 years earlier, their fathers had been retreating in humiliation, beaten, exhausted, and broken. In November 1918, after 4 relentless years of bloodshed, Germany's Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. His armies, crushed under the combined weight of British, French, and American offensives, staggered back toward their homeland. The German people faced starvation, and their empire lay in ruins. Still, among the defeated, a poisonous myth took root, the belief that Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by its own weak-willed politicians. At 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Great War came to an end. The guns finally fell silent, but the peace that followed would plant the seeds of another, far greater conflict. In the aftermath, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States journeyed to Europe with grand ideals. He promised a new world order, one built on cooperation and diplomacy rather than war. Under his guidance, the Treaty of Versailles created the League of Nations, a council where nations could settle their differences through debate, not bloodshed. The old empires of Europe were dismantled. The Austro-Hungarian realm was divided into new nations: Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany herself was carved down, stripped of land and power. Yet within this redrawing of borders lay a time bomb. Many of the new nations contained large German minorities who longed for reunion with their kin, a desire that would one day plunge Europe into chaos once more. And so, amid economic ruin, the vanquished German people suffered one final humiliation: the burden of reparations. £6 billion were to be paid to Britain and France, a sum that crippled their economy. When Wilson returned home, his dream of global unity shattered. The U.S. Congress refused to join the League of Nations, retreating instead into isolation. The great American promise of peace vanished as Europe was left to manage its own fragile destiny. Chapter 2, The Weimar Years and the Rise of Extremes, 1920 1929. Germany emerged from war as a different nation, Europe's largest in size and population, but now without its imperial crown. The old monarchy had been swept aside and replaced by a fledgling democracy, the Weimar Republic. Yet democracy proved fragile. The 1,920 seconds in Germany were years of turbulence. Streets erupted in battles between right-wing nationalists and left-wing communists, each seeking to overthrow the other. In 1923 came disaster. Hyperinflation of unimaginable scale. The German mark became worthless. Wheelbarrows of paper money could not buy a loaf of bread. Middle-class savings vanished overnight. Out of that despair, anger began to smolder. This was the soil from which extremism would grow. Among the restless veterans and frustrated patriots rose an Austrian-born former soldier named Adolf Hitler. Decorated for bravery in the Great War, Hitler returned to Munich and soon captivated crowds with fiery speeches. He joined the small National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and quickly became its leader. In October 1923, he attempted to seize power in a bold coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, but failed. Imprisoned for his crime, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book that revealed his ideology, a hatred of Jews, a belief in German racial superiority, and a vision of expansion into Eastern Europe. Upon his release, Hitler abandoned violence for politics. He set about transforming the Nazis into a disciplined machine, using the tools of democracy to undermine democracy itself. For a time, his plan seemed doomed. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany experienced relative stability. Industry recovered, culture flourished, and the nation began to breathe again. The extremists, both left and right, lost support. But this peace was fragile, resting on foreign loans and hope. In October 1929, when the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, the illusion of recovery died overnight. Chapter 3. The Fall of Democracy. 1929, 1934. The Great Depression spread across the world like a plague. In Germany, factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared past 6 million. Families starved, cities darkened, and the fragile Weimar Republic began to crumble. The people turned once again to the extremists. In the elections of 1932, Hitler's Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. His stormtroopers, the brown-shirted SA, filled the streets, intimidating opponents and projecting power. Yet Hitler himself remained outside government until the aging president Paul von Hindenburg, desperate to restore order, appointed him chancellor on the 30th of January, 1933. Within a month, the Reichstag building burned. Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers. Once granted, he used them to abolish all other political parties, dismantle the Constitution, and imprison his rivals. When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of president and chancellor, declaring himself Führer, the supreme leader of Germany. A dictatorship had been born. For the moment, the world looked on without alarm. Hitler's early years were marked not by war, but by apparent recovery. He poured money into public works, highways, housing, and industry, pulling millions out of unemployment. The Autobahn became a symbol of progress, and the economy revived. The German people, weary of hardship, embraced him as a savior. But beneath the surface, the machinery of militarism was whirring once again. Chapter 4. The Road to Rearmament. 1934, 1936. In secret, Hitler rearmed his nation. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden tanks, aircraft, and submarines. Yet German factories began producing all three. The army, once limited to 100,000 men, was tripled in size. By 1935, Hitler stepped out from secrecy into defiance. He unveiled the Luftwaffe, a modern air force boasting thousands of aircraft. The world was stunned, but did nothing. Unemployment plummeted, national pride soared, and the Führer's popularity became absolute. That same year, He reclaimed the Saarland after a popular vote returned it to German rule. In 1936, he took his boldest gamble yet, remilitarizing the Rhineland, a region that the treaty had declared off-limits to German troops. If France had marched to stop him, his bluff might have failed, but France hesitated, and Britain chose appeasement. Hitler's confidence grew. Germany hosted the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, a dazzling showcase of unity, strength, and discipline. To much of the world, Hitler appeared a firm but fair leader, restoring national dignity. Yet darker currents flowed beneath the spectacle. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and forbade them to marry Germans of pure blood. The seeds of persecution were being sown, even as the world applauded German revival. Chapter V. Rising Sun over Asia. 1938. While Europe wrestled with its ghosts, far to the east another storm gathered. Japan, a proud island nation, had risen swiftly since defeating Russia in 1905. By the 1922, it stood as a modern power, with a vast army and navy, but an unstable democracy. Its emperor was revered as divine, and its generals held immense influence. Japan's problem was simple. It had people, but few natural resources. Its factories demanded iron, coal, and oil. Its population demanded land. The generals looked across the sea to Manchuria, a rich Chinese province ripe for conquest. In 1931, without even consulting their own civilian government, Japanese forces staged an explosion on a railway line near Mukden as a pretext for invasion. They swept through Manchuria with ease and created a puppet state called Manchukuo, installing as its figurehead Puyi, the last emperor of China. The League of Nations condemned Japan's aggression, but the response from Tokyo was contemptuous. Its delegates walked out, and Japan withdrew from the League altogether. The world's first real test of collective security had failed. Flushed with success, Japan's ambitions grew. In 1937, it provoked a border incident near Beijing, sparking a full-scale invasion of China. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists of Mao Zedong formed an uneasy alliance against the invader. But Japan's forces, battle-hardened and merciless, advanced relentlessly. By the end of that year, Shanghai had fallen, and the ancient capital of Nanking was captured. There, Japanese soldiers unleashed one of the most terrible atrocities of modern times, the Nanking Massacre, in which hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered and women violated. The world watched in horror, but no nation intervened. Even when Japanese aircraft bombed and sank the American gunboat, Panay on the Yangtze River, killing U.S. sailors, the Western powers limited themselves to protests. The League of Nations, powerless to act, stood as an empty monument to failed idealism. Chapter 6. The Rise of Fascism in Italy. 1922–1938. Meanwhile in Europe, another strongman had risen to power. His name was Benito Mussolini. In 1922, Italy teetered on the edge of collapse. Strikes, inflation, and social unrest paralyzed the country. The liberal government seemed helpless. Mussolini, a journalist and veteran of the Great War, founded a new political force, the Fascist Party, promising order, discipline, and national greatness. In October 1922, he ordered his followers, the Black Shirts, to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III invited him to form a government. Once in power, Mussolini moved quickly. Opposition parties were suppressed, elections replaced by appointment, and the press brought under control. By 1925, Italy had become a dictatorship. Like Hitler later would, Mussolini's early achievements won admiration. Public works projects provided jobs, corruption was curtailed, the mafia weakened. Italy's military was rebuilt and modernized. The fascist regime projected an image of strength and efficiency. Mussolini envisioned a new Roman Empire, one that would dominate the Mediterranean. It was an ambition that would soon lead him to conquest and to alliance with Hitler's Germany. Epilogue: The Gathering Storm. By the late 1932, the fragile peace that had followed the Great War was unraveling. The democracies of Europe, haunted by memories of trench warfare, hesitated to confront aggression. Germany rearmed, Italy postured, Japan conquered, and the League of Nations, the great hope of 1919, stood powerless. The stage was set. The world had learned nothing from its past. And in the early dawn of September 1939, when German tanks crossed into Poland, the war that was meant never to happen again began anew. The road to war, the world descends into darkness. 1935-1938. Chapter 7. The Dream of Empire. By the early 1932s, Benito Mussolini had transformed Italy into a disciplined, totalitarian state. The fascist regime launched a massive program of naval construction, a fleet larger than the combined strength of the British and French Mediterranean squadrons. Italy's new warships, sleek and modern, gleamed as symbols of national pride. When the Great Depression struck, Italy seemed to withstand the crisis better than most nations. Mussolini's centralized control gave an illusion of stability. His propaganda machine proclaimed that fascism had rescued the nation from chaos, and that the Duce's leadership had made Italy a model of strength and purpose. Across the world, politicians and idealists looked with admiration and envy. Among those most inspired was Adolf Hitler, then rising in Germany, who saw in Mussolini's fascism a blueprint for his own totalitarian ambitions. But Mussolini craved more than admiration. He dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire, of new conquests that would make Italy the master of the Mediterranean. And he already had his target, the ancient African kingdom of Abyssinia, known today as Ethiopia. Italy already possessed colonies on Abyssinia's borders, Eritrea to the north and Italian Somaliland to the southeast. It was the last independent African nation not under European rule, and Mussolini viewed it as unfinished business. In December 1934, Italian and Abyssinian forces clashed at an oasis in the Ogaden Desert, deep within Abyssinian territory. Mussolini seized upon the incident as a pretext. Reinforcements poured into Eritrea and Somalia, and the Duce demanded reparations. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, appealed directly to the League of Nations. In Geneva, he pleaded before the Assembly for collective action, a small, peaceful nation appealing to the world's conscience against an aggressor that was itself a League member. This was the League's supreme test. And it failed. Britain's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, tried to negotiate a settlement, but Mussolini would not be denied. In October 1935, Italian armies invaded from Eritrea and Somaliland. Against modern artillery, tanks, and aircraft, the Abyssinians, armed largely with rifles and spears, could not hope to stand. The Italian Air Force ruled the skies, bombing troops and villages alike. On several occasions, they dropped poison gas banned as inhumane after the Great War. After 6 months of savage fighting, Abyssinia was crushed. Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. His nation was annexed to Mussolini's growing African empire. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands and imposed weak economic sanctions. But they had little effect. Mussolini's triumph revealed two grim truths. First, that the League was powerless, and second, that the democracies of Britain and France had lost the will to fight. If you're still here, I know the kind of person you are. Someone who truly cares about the past and loves to explore the world with passion. Big respect to you for staying until here. Don't forget to subscribe so you can always come back for more stories like this. Chapter 8: The Exhausted Democracies. Britain and France were still haunted by the slaughter of the First World War. Both nations had emerged victorious yet broken. Their economies had never truly recovered. Their societies had been scarred by grief, unemployment, and unrest. In Britain, successive leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay, MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, all shared one overriding goal: to avoid another war at any cost. The country's once formidable army had been dismantled after 1918, reduced to a small professional force suited only to policing its empire. When the Depression struck, plans for modernization were abandoned. The result was a nation unprepared, militarily and psychologically, for another great conflict. France's wounds ran even deeper. Her losses in 1914-18 had been catastrophic. An entire generation of young men had perished. Through the 1922, France's birth rate declined, raising fears that by the next decade there would not be enough men to defend the nation. Unable to match Germany in manpower, French strategists turned to fortification. Beginning in 1930, engineers constructed a massive line of defenses along the German frontier, the Maginot Line. Stretching to the Belgian border, it consisted of bunkers, artillery, casemates, and underground tunnels. It was an engineering marvel, but also a symbol of France's mindset, a purely defensive nation walled behind concrete. This fortress mentality meant that France could not easily project power abroad. Even had Britain possessed the troops to assist, their combined forces could not challenge Mussolini in East Africa. Their navies were outnumbered in the Mediterranean, and their people, weary of war, had no appetite for foreign entanglements. Thus, when Italy conquered Abyssinia, London and Paris did nothing. It was, they told themselves, a distant problem not worth the risk of war. The League of Nations looked the other way, and another principle of collective security crumbled into dust. Chapter 9: The Fire in Spain. If the League's weakness had been exposed in Africa, its impotence would soon be tested even closer to home. In 1936, Spain, a proud but divided nation, erupted into civil war. The conflict was among the most brutal of the century, a struggle of ideology as well as arms. Fascism against communism, monarchy against republicanism, faith against atheism, brother against brother. 5 years earlier, a left-wing government had abolished Spain's ancient monarchy and declared a republic. The reforms were modest, but they outraged the conservative elite, the church, the landowners, and the army. In February 1936, the left-wing parties united in a popular front and narrowly won national elections. The right saw it as the beginning of a communist takeover. Within the military, long a bastion of conservative and Catholic thought, a conspiracy took shape. Among its leaders was General Francisco Franco, a career officer exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On the 17th of July, 1936, units stationed in Spanish Morocco revolted. The following day, Franco flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement dedicated to saving Spain from communism. Across the country, army garrisons joined the rebellion, while loyalist forces, soldiers, workers, and volunteers rose to defend the Republic. Spain was torn in two. Franco faced an immediate obstacle. His best troops, the hardened Army of Africa, were trapped across the Strait of Gibraltar. He needed aircraft to ferry them to the mainland, and so he turned to the one man who might help Adolf Hitler. Within weeks, transport planes from Hitler's new Luftwaffe began an airlift, the first major operation of its kind, carrying Franco's soldiers into southern Spain. Soon, Italian and German aid poured in, modern tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Condor Legion, an elite German air unit, tested its latest bombers and tactics on Spanish soil. Mussolini sent a volunteer corps of 50,000 men and hundreds of aircraft. The Spanish Republic, isolated and desperate, appealed to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. But Britain and France, fearful that intervention might spark a general European war, proclaimed a policy of non-intervention. Cynically, Germany and Italy signed the same pact even as they continued to flood Franco with men and weapons. Only the Soviet Union chose to respond. Stalin, alarmed by the spread of fascism, sent tanks, aircraft, and about 700 military advisors. Yet his support was limited and came at a high political price. Thousands of idealists from across the world volunteered to fight for the Republic. They formed the International Brigades, men and women from America, Britain, France, and Germany, united by their belief that Spain was the front line in the battle against tyranny. The war quickly turned into a nightmare. Franco's forces, now heavily armed, advanced from the south and northwest. By late 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides. The siege of the capital became a grim symbol of defiance. Both sides committed atrocities. The Republicans executed priests and conservatives, while the Nationalists massacred anyone suspected of left-wing sympathies. German and Italian aircraft bombed cities mercilessly. In April 1937, the Basque town of Guernica was annihilated in one of the first deliberate air raids on civilians, a prelude to the terror that would engulf Europe. The Republican forces fought valiantly but were outmatched. Poorly trained militias faced professional armies equipped with modern weapons. As the war dragged on, divisions within the Republican camp deepened. Communists urged discipline and military unity, while anarchists and syndicalists sought a social revolution amid the fighting. In May 1937, these tensions exploded into violence between rival factions in Barcelona. The infighting fatally weakened the Republican cause. By late 1938, Franco's nationalists controlled most of Spain. Barcelona fell early in 1939. Madrid, exhausted and starving, surrendered that March. After nearly 3 years of bloodshed, Franco declared victory. The Civil War had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left Spain in ruins. Its scars would endure for generations. But beyond Spain's borders, the consequences were even more profound. Hitler and Mussolini had learned that the democracies would not act, not even when fascism destroyed a fellow republic. Stalin, disillusioned by their passivity, lost faith in any alliance with the West. The stage was set for the next act of aggression. Chapter X. The March Toward Anschluss. While Spain bled, Germany was preparing for expansion. From the moment Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he had spoken of his grand design, the conquest of Lebensraum, living space, in the East. In February 1933, he told his generals that their task was to prepare for territorial expansion. Germany's destiny, he declared, lay in the East in the lands of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Although the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden tanks and aircraft, Germany had secretly developed both. Under a covert agreement with the Soviet Union in the 1922nd, German officers tested tank designs and new tactics on Russian soil. Young commanders such as Heinz Guderian studied the theories of fast-moving warfare, the integration of tanks, motorized infantry, and air support that would later become known as Blitzkrieg. By 1935, Hitler felt ready to reveal his hand. He announced the recreation of the Luftwaffe and the expansion of the army to 300,000 men. Conscription was reintroduced. Britain and France protested weekly at these blatant violations of Versailles, but no action followed. They themselves, belatedly recognizing the danger, began to rearm, but far too slowly. Up to this point, Hitler had presented his moves as the correction of injustices. He had merely reclaimed what was rightfully Germany's the Rhineland, the Saar, but now his ambition turned outward, toward his homeland, Austria. The idea of uniting all Germans into one Reich had long been central to his vision. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had attempted a coup in Vienna, but failed. 4 years later, Hitler saw his chance. In February 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg uncovered another Nazi plot. He protested to Berlin. Hitler responded with fury, demanding that Austria cease persecuting its Nazis and instead unite formally with Germany. Under immense pressure, Schuschnigg agreed to hold a referendum on independence, a last desperate attempt to preserve his nation's sovereignty. But Hitler had no intention of leaving the outcome to chance. Chapter 11. The Collapse of Peace, 1938–1939. In early March 1938, the Austrian government announced a referendum to let its people decide whether to remain independent. But Adolf Hitler, fearful that the vote might not favor him, resolved to act before the ballots could be cast. At dawn on the 12th of March 1938, German troops crossed the border. The invasion took Austria completely by surprise, yet it met with little resistance. In the streets of Vienna and Linz, crowds cheered and saluted as the soldiers of the Third Reich paraded in triumph. Nazi sympathizers showered the troops with flowers, and within hours, Austria was under German control. It was a conquest without a battle, the first bloodless annexation of Hitler's empire. The next day he proclaimed that Austria was now part of Greater Germany. The Anschluss, as it became known, erased a sovereign nation from Europe's map. For the first time since the Great War, one state had swallowed another, and again the Western democracies stood by in silence. Buoyed by his success, Hitler set his sights on his next target, Czechoslovakia. In the northwest of that young nation lay the Sudetenland, a mountainous region home to nearly 3 million ethnic Germans. These Sudeten Germans had once belonged to the Austrian Empire, but were cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919. Hitler exploited their discontent, urging them to demand autonomy and protection from alleged Czech oppression. When Prague refused to yield, he threatened war. Undeterred, the Czechoslovak government mobilized its army, one of the best in Europe, and prepared to fight. Its frontier defenses were formidable, and for a moment Hitler hesitated. But Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, fearing another catastrophic war, decided to intervene. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler, seeking a peaceful settlement. Twice, the Führer assured him that if granted the Sudetenland, Germany would make no further claims in Europe. On September 29, in Munich, Chamberlain met Hitler again, joined by Mussolini and French Premier Édouard Daladier. Without consulting Czechoslovakia, the four leaders signed an agreement. Germany would receive the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's solemn promise of peace. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved the signed document before the cheering crowd, declaring that it guaranteed peace for our time. Yet within days, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and seized its powerful frontier fortifications. Czechoslovakia was left defenseless. Hitler now turned his gaze eastward. His next objective was Poland. The pretext, once again, was the fate of ethnic Germans stranded by the Treaty of Versailles. He demanded the return of the port city of Danzig, now Gdańsk, to connect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. The Polish government refused. For the moment, Hitler paused. He was not yet ready for a general war, and he still had unfinished business in the heart of Europe. In March 1939, taking advantage of ethnic tensions, he moved again. The Slovak region of Czechoslovakia petitioned Berlin for independence. Hitler summoned Czech Prime Minister Emil Hácha to the Reich Chancellery and, after a night of threats and intimidation, forced him to accept German protection. The next morning, German troops entered Prague unopposed. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist, part annexed, part reduced to a puppet state. For the first time, Hitler had conquered a non-German people. The reaction from Britain and France was muted but shifting. Shocked by the destruction of a democratic ally, they at last realized that appeasement had failed. When Hitler renewed his demands for Danzig at the end of March, both nations pledged that an attack on Poland would mean war. Yet by now, the German leader cared little for diplomacy. He was convinced that his opponents lacked the courage to fight. In the East, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin also watched the situation with growing unease. In April, he proposed an alliance with Britain and France, but the talks dragged on without result. Disillusioned, Stalin sought his own bargain. On the 23rd of August 1939, the world was stunned by the announcement of a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The two sworn enemies had become partners. Secret clauses divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them, while the Baltic states would fall to Moscow. Freed from the fear of Soviet intervention, Hitler issued his final order. On the evening of August 31, the German armed forces prepared to strike. Before dawn, they would cross the Polish frontier. The decision had been made, a decision that would plunge the world once more into the furnace of war. Thank you for staying with us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed it, remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be with us next time as we travel even deeper into the past. Until then, take care, stay curious, and never stop exploring the story of humankind.